Hello, welcome to workshop number 6, Housing, Social and Well-being, the role of housing on social sustainability and well-being of residents. Our speakers for this workshop are Professor Cathy Michel, Deputy Dean of the Faculty of Engineering and Built Environment, University of the Cape Town, Professor Nouman Ahmed, Dean of the Faculty of Architecture and Management Science, NED University, and Dr. Abid Mahmoud, Head of Cities and Sustainable Places, Cardiff University.
And I just start to give you a very brief introduction about the SIAH project and about some summary of the previous 5 workshops. So I'm just not put too much time on that one because I believe majority of you know about the SIAH already. SIAH is just aimed to develop the interdisciplinary network and the partnership worldwide to respond effectively to the complex housing challenges in the Africa. As we know, we have a 115 million house backlog for the affordable housing in across the Africa, and only 45% of the Africa urban developer is live in the adequate housing. So we are very familiar with the problem, especially for the low-income housing and informal settlement. So this is the big issue, and we just try to solve or just tackle this problem with coming and just creating the network all together. The rationale for SIAH is just solving the complex multidisciplinary problem of the housing. It cannot be solved by the expert, professional, and the policymaker working alone and silo. So we just try to make that kind of platform, and all the stakeholders for the housing is just coming and just have a network talking together and share the knowledge. And SIAH will empower the local stakeholder and community to redevelop the improvement of the habitats, infrastructure, and service of the affordable housing by sharing the new knowledge and expertise. We have a 4 objectives in the SIAH. The first one is establish an interdisciplinary platform for Africa housing stakeholder. The second one is introduce the latest innovative technology and techniques to the African housing stakeholder. The next one is just train the next generation of African researcher, innovator, and collaborative problem solver. And the last one is just engender technology transfer and capacity development between African academic and industry sector to make a bridge between the industry and academia. SIAH just tried to tackle these 12 SDG goals directly or indirectly. So I'm not just reading that one, but the main and the most important is just SDG 11, which is just sustainable city and communicate. SIAH is just founded by the Royal Academy of the Engineering and sponsored by the University of the Cape Town, NHBRC of the South Africa, Agreement of the South Africa, and hosted by the Sustainability-Oriented Cyber Research Unit for the Built Environment. As of now, we have a 20 institution, government agency, and the organization partner working very closely to the SIAH. We have already organized 5 workshops under the SIAH. The first one focus on the housing finance and the policy. The second one focus on the housing design. The third focus on the housing market in South Africa. Fourth, housing construction. And the last one, which is the previous one, is housing environment. If I want to just give you a very brief about each of the workshop, so I just prepared 1 slide per speaker. Mr. Simon from the Western Cape government, he just explained and discussed the 4 elements of the sustainable house and discussed and explained that the sustainable house is a house can just live, work, play, and learn. Ms. Ross from the Center of the Affordable Housing for Africa just shared the latest research and showed the Africa affordable housing condition. So as you see, across Africa, the majority of the country, still, the house is not affordable for the people. A majority of the people, they cannot afford to buy the cheapest newly bought houses, as just illustrated by the orange and the red color. And the few countries in Africa, they can just afford for buying the cheapest newly houses, which is just shown by green. Mr. Company from the city of the Cape Town show us the duration of the housing delivery, which is just minimum 4.5 years, sometimes go to the 15 years, and just show a lot of overlap or the process. All this process is just very necessary and important, but sometimes we see some like overlap in the process, which hopefully with using the innovative technology, we can just remove this kind of overlap. Professor Gonzalo from the Montreal University of the Canada, he just explained about the condition of the house and the importance of the housing. He believed developing a house is not a challenging, but developing a house which the people and the community can happily live together is just a challenge. And to just reach that kind of house, we need to consider the following items, such as the social justice, including the informal sector in design and construction of the house, sustain engaging of all the stakeholders, consider flexibility and adaptability in the design, and stop trying to simplify housing issues. Professor Abdul Ramadan from the Middle East University highlighted the importance of the specification list in the design and construction of the affordable housing. So she just listed some of the most important specifications, which are safety and security, comfort, social context, stability, durability, flexibility, and modularity, and independency of the houses. Professor Engineer Byron from the NHPRC explained the three levels of the housing design in the South Africa, and he just introduced and explained those initial or the important rule and regulation should to consider during the design in South Africa. Mr. McCoffin from the Urban Real Estate Research Unit explained about the housing market in the South Africa and show us the housing market in the South Africa is not healthy now, because the development cost is just more than the value of the house. He just proved value differ across the city, but costs of the different houses are similar because of the services, substructure, and superstructure cost of the houses. To just make the market healthier, he just recommended the following intervention: ensure infrastructure capacity, innovation in the small scale finance, innovation in design, innovation in the building materials, and innovation in technology. Professor Maichi from the University of Johannesburg, he just explained the innovation in the housing and the importance role of the industrialization in the building system. If we can just do that one, we can shift from the mass production to the mass customization, which is just very important, and it can just improve the sustainability of the house. To do that one, he recommended the following item: partnership between the public and private sector, prefab and modular construction, investment in the cutting-edge manufacturing equipment, and innovative industry with the sound research and development. In the same workshop under the construction, Dr. Omatayo from the Leeds University shared some lessons from the UK social housing project with us, which the more important lesson he shared with us are as use central information modeling, such as the BIM, develop a building accreditation rate aligned with the BIM, establish a cost database for easier cost analysis of the sustainable innovative housing, more application of modular building construction and design for manufacturing and assembly, and include affordable sustainable housing and BIM in the education sector. In the previous workshop, which focused on the environment, Professor Brown from the University of the Cape Town discussed about the importance role of the housing in the environment. And he just showed us the building globally generate in 1 in 3 tons of the CO2 and use 1/3 of the fresh water. He explained the importance of the passive design, such as the natural lighting, natural ventilation, and insulation thermal. And he just drew a big picture of the future of African houses, which are the renewable energy, using the renewable energy. They are the houses net zero in the carbon, water, ecology, and the waste. And they are the houses with the net positive, or even they can regenerate the generative houses for the water and also for the energy. Dr. Isaac from the Convent University of Nigeria, he classified the building materials in the two groups of the sustainable material and unsustainable material. And he just explained the importance of using this sustainable material and what's the impact of using this sustainable material to each of the sector or the stakeholder of the housing. And to minimize the environment impact, he suggested to use more sustainable material, promote indigenous building technology, policy making to support investment in the low-income housing, enforce compliance with the city master plan, provision of the water, sanitation, and waste management facilities, make living in the rural area more attractive, focus on construction of affordable housing, investment in the land and the real estate. And last week, we just started with the SIAH design competition. The SIAH design competition is open now, and the expression for the interest is due on end of the April. So the first prize for this competition is £2,000, and the second prize is £1,000. You can just find more details and the general specification and all the information you need on the SIAH website. Please visit the SIAH website and participate in this interesting competition. Without further ado, we are just going to the workshop for today, which is just workshop number 6 of the SIAH, focus on the housing, social, and well-being. We have 3 excellent speakers for this workshop. The first speaker is Professor Cathy Michel, Facility Management and the Quantity Surveyor, Deputy Dean of Engineering and Built Environment, University of the Cape Town. Our second speaker is Professor Nouman Ahmed, Architect and Planner, Dean of the Faculty of Architecture and Management Science, Net University of Pakistan. And the third speaker is Dr. Abid Mahmood, Social Scientist, Head of the City and Sustainable Place, University of Cardiff University. So I just stop sharing, so the Professor Michel can just start her interesting presentation. Prof, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ali. Just give me a sec to get going. All good, Ali?
Yes.
Okay. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. For my presentation, I thought what would probably be useful is if I lay a contextual foundation, I think, for Prof. Ahmed and Dr. Mahmood, who are going to follow me, if that makes sense. So I'm going to give a whirlwind tour of what do we mean by socially sustainable urban development and management and quality of life in African cities. So if we start by understanding the contextual problem that we face. So generally, cities across the globe are facing rapid urbanization. We all know that. And they're expected to be at the front line of addressing issues of global sustainability. The majority of the world's population growth is expected to be concentrated in urban areas of what is considered to be the global south. The term cities of the global south refers to countries that do not have fully industrialized economies, or in another phrase, in post-colonial terms, it refers to countries that have experienced some form of colonial domination, which has left a permanent mark on their economic, cultural, and political landscape. So within this context, cities across Africa, in the main, are characterized by multiple forms of poverty, growing inequality, environmental degradation, slums and informal settlements, social and economic exclusion, and spatial segregation. Coupled with all of those challenges, African cities are facing significant challenges in terms of both planning for and coping with rapid population growth and urbanization. We have a relatively young population compared to the developed world, as indicated by the yellow and the orange, where less than 20% of our population across the continent roughly is over the age of 60. So when we compare ourselves in that regard to the developed world, it is important to note that our cities display as well the most acute forms of ecological degradation and economic disparity. Cities across Africa in the main, as I've said already, have these very high levels of poverty and inequality. And add to this the spatial separation of residential areas from access to economic opportunities, and burgeoning informal settlements that really do lack the adequate infrastructure and services to sustain human life in the long term. And that picture there is from Accra in Ghana. It's Sodom and Gomorrah. That is the reality for a very large proportion of our population in African cities. An additional challenge that faces African cities that we have to grapple with is the existence of a dual approach by governments across the continent in their spending policies. The duality occurs where African cities are promoted in the global economy in order to stimulate investment and development in a particular country or an urban region. But at the same time, governments have a spending policy that is aligned primarily with the upliftment of the urban poor. Now, both of these objectives can be viewed and should be viewed in a positive light, but it creates an unmanageable tension for government, where on the one hand, they're driving economic opportunity in terms of being globally competitive, but on the other hand, they are creating an environment for the continued exclusion of the urban poor and a resultant continuation and effective steady growth in the social and spatial segregation of those communities in our urban areas that are most in need of assistance. When you add to that very low levels of transparency in real estate or property markets across the continent, which makes investors even more reluctant to invest in our urban areas, and high levels of uncertainty with respect to macroeconomic forecasts. I haven't quite done yet. We have a few more challenges that we are facing. Many African cities are also characterized by varying levels of institutional underdevelopment or development, and a clear inability to facilitate the development and management of the sustainable city concept. The unintended consequence of this has resulted in a significant growth in the number of non-state actors playing a key role in service delivery mechanisms to the urban poor. And this is not a situation that is unique to cities of the global south. The challenge with the prevalence of these non-state actors is twofold. The first is that it has the potential to overlay a form of urban governance that may not necessarily serve the interests of the majority of the local populace within African cities. And secondly, it has the potential to replicate historical westernized development paradigms that are seen to be, by many, seen to be a significant contributor to economic and social exclusion, and therefore the declining quality of life in our cities. This rapid rate of urbanization in African cities brings with it a range of additional challenges for national and local policymakers across the continent, in that they now need to mediate between rapid and unregulated urbanization and achieve sustainable development simultaneously. These issues remain significant obstacles to sustainable development on the continent. In this regard, the built environment sector has a meaningful role to play in addressing these challenges via effective planning, designing, financing, developing, governing, and managing of real estate or property in human settlements, in urban precincts, and in cities in order to improve the quality of life of its citizens and therefore the social sustainability. One significant challenge that we face, on top of all the others, is the fourth industrial revolution, which currently is being punted as the panacea to Africa's urban problems or urban challenges. It's clear that we are at a critical tipping point, I believe, in Africa's development. The 4IR is touted or seen by many as having the potential to turbocharge the socioeconomic development across the continent. We are by far the youngest continent in the world, with 60% of our population being youth, classified as youth, and the digital economy is being seen as an opportunity to unlock a new future for Africa's estimated 700 million young people. So the question I'd want to put into the workshop is this real? Does this have the potential to be a reality for us, or are we just chasing the golden city of Wakanda? What we do know is that we cannot try to transplant a Eurocentric aesthetic onto our African context. The African continent has its own history and its own future, and innovation occurring on the continent for the continent must be cognizant of that. So what is appropriate for the developed world is not necessarily appropriate for us, and we need to be aware of our contextual landscape in leveraging social sustainability and quality of life for citizens within African cities. If we move now into sustainability and sustainable urban development and management. Sustainable development and management may be seen to be the defining challenge of the 21st century. I'm sure that everybody in the workshop is aware that the concept was conceived through the Brundtland Report back in 1987. Essentially, this report sought to reconcile environmental considerations with that of human development, or the social aspect of sustainability. As human development is concentrated in urban areas, global sustainability needs to be addressed at the urban and the suburban levels. And as always, as a good academic, I'm going to challenge you a little bit now and say that the challenge with relying on the Brundtland definition is that epistemologically it is grounded in the triple bottom line, which everybody's aware of, people, planet, profit. And that in relation to the urban poor, the concept of sustainability in terms of that triple bottom line is too narrowly defined. In African cities, the need to address widespread socioeconomic crises is a more urgent priority necessarily than that of pure urban environmentalism. So one place to look to find resonance for us is in the UN Habitat 3 New Urban Agenda and the 5 dimensions to sustainable urban development, that is social, environmental, ecological, physical, and political. And more specifically, one can look to the SDGs. This lens on urban sustainability makes significant strides in addressing the narrower definition of sustainability. But what we need is a clearer articulation of the actual implementation of these policies and strategies. Policies and strategies are great, but we are now at a point in time where we need to actually actively translate that into action. More often than not, these policies also fail to articulate how the sustainable developments are to be managed, and more importantly, do not require built environment professionals to be cognizant of the management of the real estate or property and urban precincts in the development phases of the project. So they don't actually require the built environment professionals to be aware of how these areas are going to be managed and operated post-construction. The focus is purely on delivery, and very little cognizance is actually given to the post-construction phase. An overriding theme for me anyway, embedded in the SDGs, is that it is essential that urban sustainability in cities of the global south focuses primarily on the socioeconomic concerns related to urban poverty, and more specifically on quality of life and social sustainability. So essentially, social sustainability refers to the human factor. At best, the social pillar has become a catchphrase for a variety of powers that either tie the economic and environmental pillars together or actually divides them. This social pillar has historically been built from an open-ended list of elements that contribute to what is stated to be a socially livable society. And these range from norms, confidence, reciprocity, to livability, health, equity, community growth, social support, human rights, community resilience, human adaptation, social justice, a whole range of labels that are given to the social pillar within the broader sustainability concept. The challenge here is that the word social is ambiguous. It carries both empirical and normative meaning, and as a result, it is perhaps more appropriate to see social sustainability as a collection of features rather than attempting to assign it a meaning per se. And if these features occur simultaneously, then the collection of features will vary from one context to the next or from one urban precinct to the next. So some authors in the field of social sustainability would argue or advocate for social capital and social capability within communities or within citizens, while others emphasize basic needs, quality of life, social justice, and social cohesion, and others use social capital as a theoretical foundation for social sustainability. So as if we didn't have enough complexity already to deal with. So if we focus just specifically on quality of life, quality of life is defined by the World Health Organization as an individual's perception of their position in life in the context of the culture and value systems in which they live and in relation to their goals, expectations, standards, and concerns. Quality of life is a highly subjective measure of happiness that is an important component of many financial decisions that are made by investors and developers prior to actually developing real estate or property. So factors that play a role in the quality of life vary according to personal preferences, but they often include things like financial security, job satisfaction, family life, health, and safety, which I believe housing actually starts to tick many of those boxes. Now, when we look at quality of life, many of us would immediately start with a top-down approach and ask, what are the indicators for quality of life? So I'm going to flip it on its head and say to you, what if we start rather from the bottom up and ask what would be considered a low quality of life? What is the effect of a low quality of life? And how do we rather move from there rather than a top-down? So low quality of life essentially means to decrease living standards, in the absence of basic needs, but also in the absence of social needs, cultural needs, emotional and spiritual needs. So low quality of life means basically a poor standard of life, and the effect of a low quality of life or a lack of fulfillment of basic needs and very acute problems associated with health and sanitation in our urban areas. So where does sustainable, innovative, affordable housing fit in with this? Given the complex challenges that we face, I think it would be quite easy or relatively easy to argue that housing is at the cornerstone, was the foundation for improving the quality of life of the urban poor and therefore in achieving socially sustainable communities. Three thoughts that I have that are bound together with sustainable, innovative, affordable housing. The one is we need to be very clear about management of the urban precinct to encourage a sense of community. If you don't encourage a sense of community within residents in an urban area, you're not going to actually start to achieve that quality of life and therefore that socially sustainable kind of community that we're looking for. It needs to be, whatever we do, it needs to be participatory, collaborative, and integrated to create a sense of ownership and well-being. And I would suggest that one way to do this is by using something called a community-based facilities management framework. So what is community-based FM? This emergent concept of community-based facilities management has its philosophical roots in the socially oriented view of facilities management. This school of thought within the FM literature argues for a deeper understanding about the relationship between space, place, people, process, and technology, and more importantly, the nature of the interactions between the users of the facility or the property and the urban precinct. It further argues that action is needed to be very definitely at the local level, or in other words, an understanding of the contours of the patterns of poverty need to be understood within a local context in applying community-based FM. This context would need to take cognizance of the location, the social group, the specific urban area, the culture, and obviously the country. At the heart of a community-based orientation in alleviating poverty in urban areas is the creation of successful partnerships with communities And in that way, you start to provide opportunities that have a direct benefit to the local community. It is defined as the processes by which all stakeholders in a community work together to plan, deliver, and maintain the enabling environment that they need, within which the local economy can prosper, quality services can be delivered, and natural resources protected in order that citizens can enjoy a quality of life. So it's a very practical framework, an attempt to address the very fundamental basic needs that are missing or absent, rather, in many of our urban areas in Africa. It is underpinned by 4 very key dimensions or pillars: local economic development, social development, community participation, and obviously sustainability. What is central to the idea around community-based FM, or the framework, is that the community is seen as a key participant in the planning, delivery, management, and maintenance of the facility. It is seen as a means of developing social capital and addressing directly on the ground, grassroots level issues around social cohesion in areas of poverty. The greater the encouragement of the community-based options for the use and maintenance and management of community assets, the greater the capacity of communities to undertake their own local development. And it is seen by many internationally to encompass the facilities management issues from a social and community perspective, and comprises 4 key dimensions if you're going to have any high-level takeaways. The one is the process of engagement and collaboration among stakeholders. Secondly, the creation of an enabling environment for participation, achieving a balance between social and environmental values, and lastly, quality of life. So what do we know so far at this stage? We know that wherever we have applied this framework, every community is unique and uniquely complex. So it takes time and true listening to the voices on the ground to develop a nuanced framework for each community. When working in a community-based FM framework, you need to immediately acknowledge that the community is actually a resource in this process. They're not merely a participant. One needs to often be innovative and think outside the box. The process has to be participative, collaborative, and integrative in order for you to achieve that long-term buy-in from the community in the maintenance and operation and management of the property or real estate or facility. You need some form of good governance structure. It doesn't work where built environment professionals continue to work in their silos. They have to work in a holistic manner. And the important thing to remember as well with community-based FM is that it requires a holistic and systemically grounded lens of the context of a particular community prior to implementing any kind of framework. So what a group of us have actually managed to start to put together is, how do you actually start to pull a sustainable development agenda into a managerial framework that can then begin to provide a holistic response to the challenges that we face. So we've got a series of imperatives that we have established through research to date. The one is the nature of the framework, the environmental, social, and economic criteria, the expertise that's required. We do know that it also needs to be market-driven because we don't have a market, we don't have a real estate property market, we start to have a bit of a challenge, and we need to recognize complexity and the institutional aspects. I'm not going to read the table, but if you want the detail, the reference is at the bottom. So what are the challenges that we face going forward? The challenges are numerous, and I think I always believe that, a journey of 1,000 miles has started with a single step. You can't start to panic about the end point, but if we each just take one step in the right direction, we'll all get there in the end. So the challenges are numerous, and what I've proposed in the presentation is not the panacea for the problems that we face. It is clear from research and where we are at the moment that it is imperative that in meeting the challenges, we need to embrace the 5 dimensions to sustainability, which includes the social aspect. Another critical aspect to achieving sustainable urban development and management would be the need to approach housing development and management in an inclusionary safe, resilient, and sustainable manner. And that requires active mechanisms on the part of government and built environment professionals to assist in planning, financing, developing, governing, and managing of the housing development process, and then the subsequent urban precinct and or city. I would argue that it's only in taking a holistic view of the development process and the subsequent management of the product that both the developer and society as a whole are able to capture the true social value embedded in the development and management process. What we need are frameworks that are capable of accommodating the uniqueness and complexity of different urban environments in a way that actually focuses on mobilizing community resources and social capital. And more importantly, what is required are innovative new ways to promote urban sustainability within cities. It's clear that the old way has not worked because we're still faced with numerous sustainability issues in our urban areas globally, in fact. It is critical that these frameworks draw on the experiences of local stakeholders and the local community, in other words, see them as a resource to generate participatory, collaborative, co-learning, all those fancy words, and integrated initiatives to drive sustainability and alleviate urban poverty, whilst remaining grounded in the good governance that is needed. And I think probably also quite important that the frameworks need to be founded on the premise that the built environment disciplines cannot operate and exist independently as they have in the past, especially when they're driving an urban sustainability and particularly a quality of life or social sustainability agenda. The systemic nature of the issues associated with sustainability requires unity and collaboration in the pursuit of an equitable, socially responsible, and environmentally conscious development. So somehow we need to break those silos and actually get the teams working cohesively together. I think I'm almost out of time. So yeah, and I'm at the end. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, Prof. It's just you highlighted a lot of right points, which we just also listened or heard about that one in the previous workshop. Yes, the sustainability, social sustainability and engagement of the community to the management of their houses and their housing is just a main key in the low income level. We have some interesting questions from the Sonia in the chat. So we just keep those questions and just have some like a Q&A or the discussion at the end of the session. So we are not just waiting anymore. We are just go to the next speaker, Professor Norman. I just put Professor Norman Ahmed CV and the short bio in the chat for those people that are interested to know more about the Prof. Please check the chat. And if you have any question or comments, please share on the chat facility. Prof, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ali, and thank you, Kathy, for a wonderful discourse. It has set the scene. I am now going to take you to a rather remote location, and that is Pakistan, away from South Africa. The short presentation and discourse that I'm going to offer for today's workshop refers to the various innovative responses that we have in Pakistan, especially during the past 70 plus years after gaining independence from the British colonial rule, and the various challenges that we have faced over the period of time in getting these innovative responses mainstreamed into the policy discourse and applications. And it is a struggle which has not ended and perhaps has become much more complex. Just to give you a background about the context, Pakistan is a very populous country, as you can imagine. It is set in South Asia, and South Asia itself as a region has a sizable part of the global population. And the bulk of this population actually lives in poverty, putting India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and other countries of the region together. Pakistan is right now a country of about 216 million people, and about a third of it is urban. However, I will just take a while to talk about this percentage that it refers to the way in which we measure urbanization. And that is usually the administrative definition of urban because usually people in a population census are counted as urban, those ones who live in notified urban areas. However, researches into South Asian urbanization, and especially in Pakistan, it has revealed that there are various locations across the territory in which people exist and live in an urban condition. They resort to an urban lifestyle without necessarily possessing a locational or a special link to a formal urban location. So this is one observation. So while this percentage appears to be conservative, the actual scale of urbanization is significant. The other finding that recent research has informed us is that in about 9 years from now, in 2030, the country will be 50% or half of the population shall be living in urban areas, which means that there is a huge challenge that urban locations that exist, that have been formally recognized as such, they are going to experience, and obviously the existing urban locations are also going to push their territorial boundaries into what is conventionally called as the countryside. And obviously, the challenge of urbanization is going to become much more complex as it is now. Consequently, the housing demand in Pakistan is substantial. A sizable number of people are still without appropriate housing. The reasons and the consequences are several. There is obviously a natural population growth, which is substantial. There is housing that has already outlived its utility. It has well past its design life and it's lying in very dilapidated condition that needs replacement. There is a sociological change. The large and extended clans and joint families are now being replaced by nuclear families, and that is causing a greater demand of housing. And finally, there are a large number of people who are moving from the countryside to urban locations and especially to larger cities. And this migratory need is causing an enormous amount of challenge because in many parts, the political decision makers are not very comfortable to accommodate and absorb incoming population because every migration or every segment of migration actually changes the political constituencies and the political realities of the respective locations where it is happening. Much of this migration is actually taking place around the large cities, including Karachi. And just to give you a background figure, that 54% of the total urban population in Pakistan actually reside in 10 large cities. So that shows you that how concentrated and overwhelming this urbanization is. Recent statistics inform that the country requires about 10 million housing units, which is a very large number. Some housing indicators of Pakistan, we know that how the urban population is increasing faster than the normal population rate. And for that reason, the overall requirement for housing is substantial. The number of households are also increasing at a very high pace because of the reasons that families are breaking into nuclear families, and also the lifestyles of people is also changing very fast. About a half of Pakistan's urban population live in a very overcrowded situation. Most of them have only a single room with some basic amenities available. That is the optimum accommodation available. Sizable number of these people do not have access to the fundamental amenities of life, such as running water and access to pipe sanitation. As the statistics inform that 25% of these of population has access to sanitation, which shows that the basic conditions of living are very, very challenged. There was a population census and a light counting that took place about 4 years from now, but due to enormous amount of political contentions, the detailed results of this census are still not yet or are not announced. there have been several types of responses to the housing need that we found evolved ever since the country came into being or the country became independent. At one point in time, towards the earlier time periods after the country was created, there was uh, an emphasis on supplying built up units with enormous amount of inbuilt subsidy. And these type of schemes, which started about half a century ago, they were initiated in large cities such as Karachi, Lahore, and other places. And since they were extremely capital intensive, it was found that the state would not be able to continue with this approach because there were other priorities of public spending. And very soon, these schemes were abandoned. The lessons learned were that in majority of the cases, there was very poor cost recovery, and there were numerous administrative and managerial problems because the process of identification and delivery were hugely challenged by the stakeholders concerned. Uh, the next approach that was adopted by the state agencies was to supply serviced and unserviced land. And this was done in almost all the large and medium cities uh, through a process of open announcements and open balloting. There were applications invited for people to obtain lots of land. And in doing that, the state tried to reach out to the urban poor. However, what actually happened was that when this open-ended land supply was initiated, the people with better affordability and better capacity to invest their surplus into land resources, they came forward. And a huge market, a speculative market evolved, where the actual targeted were elbowed out, but the people who had relatively better affordability status, they were able to access the supply of land and monopolize it. The net practical outcome of this approach was that while land was supplied in the market, much of this land actually remained unutilized because the people who bought this land were obviously not in need of housing, and they only wanted to create a kind of a capital reserve in the form of this allotted land. So this process continued on, and in many ways, in very small fragments, this is still applied in several cities across the country. Over the period of time, large number of people from rural areas entered into the city for want of urban employment. There were different types of agricultural reforms. The mechanization and of agriculture pushed many of the agricultural labor into the cities because the options of obtaining of livelihood in the cities, they became scarce. And many of these people started living in self-created squatters, both on the state land as well as the other land that was available or accessible to them in many ways. And the larger cities experienced the development of squatters to a greater extent. And this created a premise whereby uh, the government resorted to several approaches. In the first instance, they simply applied bulldozing, and the people were not allowed to occupy the state land. And there was a constant hide and seek that was played around. However, around 1970s, it was assumed that the population of this magnitude can simply not be bulldozed, and the process of a rational regularization has to be introduced. And under the advice of several international agencies, such as the United Nations Development Programme and the United Nations Center for Human Settlements, UN Habitat, and other agencies, frameworks were defined, different types of technical premises were created, legal framework was introduced, and a process of regularization of squatter settlements it was put into action. And that became very useful because it prevented evictions from taking place and provided some assurance to the urban poor. There were plenty in our cities. Uh, Recently, this process has been halted, and in very recent times, we find that there is a massive process of evictions that has been unleashed on the lands that have been occupied and developed by people on their own. And this is because of the interplay between different stakeholders. The builders and developers who intend to transform urban lands into parcels of real estate, they have an overwhelming influence on the policymakers. And hence they are able to convince them that if we clear out the squatters or create some kind of a footprint of real estate in these strategically located lands, then basically better dividends will evolve and will benefit the government in the form of taxes and other types of benefits. So while the squatters are rising in a very precarious situation, the possibilities of them getting regularized are becoming very challenged. There was substantial amount of research that was done by different urban researchers since several years. I'm just putting forward a few titles that had a seminal effect on the discourse related to housing, upgradation, and access. This is a very interesting book that was written by our Dutch colleagues, Professor Jan van der Linden. It's called as Between Basti Dwellers and Bureaucrats. Basti stands for squatter settlements, and bureaucrats were the people who were controlling the overall urban policy. So this book actually documents the process of squatter upgrading in Karachi. And while it was written about 4 decades ago, it is still very relevant. There were other similar type of research ventures that tried to document these processes and derive appropriate learning for application into the policy and creating a premise for influencing decision making in favor of the urban poor. Karachi squatter settlement upgrading, this was again done by Free University Amsterdam with local counterparts. Recently, the state has resorted to a large scale project on a nationwide basis. This is called as NEA, or New Pakistan Housing Program. And under this program, the target is to provide housing credit access to lower and middle income group. This has acquired enormous amount of political support, as the Prime Minister himself is a very vocal proponent of this program. However, the challenge that one faces is that a sizable number of urban poor do not possess access to land or do not have ownership of any kind of land. And in the absence of land, they cannot access the housing credit, because having some kind of an ownership is a prerequisite to access credit. So while we had several negotiations with the government, we were not able to convince them that a mechanism of cooperative ownership of land of some kind may be worked out to enable a vast majority of urban poor benefit from this program. Now, while the state had its own doings, there were a large number of pilot projects that were initiated either by research organizations, by the group of academics, and also by certain socially minded, public spirited state agencies. So these pilot projects were done from different perspectives, and they had a very significant role in creating a discourse and also causing some kind of an impact on the policy. One of them is the Orangi pilot project, which was reasonably well known. This project basically aimed at providing the access to infrastructure by involving community resources. And it tried to keep the cost of provision of infrastructure very low, so that by mobilizing the communities and deriving some kind of a local capital, the immediate issue of sanitation could be addressed at the local level, and then lobbying could be undertaken with the state agencies to connect their investments into sanitation to make the both ends of sanitation work for the people. These are some of the views in which very basic type of mobilization techniques were involved, and the local community activists, they were trained not only to engage with people, but also to communicate the technical merits of coming together and contributing labor and other community resources in building up their own land level sanitation system. This is, in fact, the scale of the lane level sewers and other infrastructure that was purely developed based upon the community resources, and the sustenance of this sanitation system was basically derived by connecting it with the options that were developed by the local government. This is a layout of one of the largest squatter settlements in Karachi, Orangi. This is the process in which you can see that the people were contributing labor themselves. They were initially given training, their capacities were actually built, and not only they contributed in the manual labor, they also learned the various essential technical the tips that were necessary to lay down a proper, soundly functioning sanitation system. They also kept the accounts and collected the local contributions on their own under the supervision of a local NGO. It was believed that the governments would learn from such pilot projects and incorporate these type of learnings into their respective urban development policies. There was some partial success achieved. Certain regional governments became very excited about the successes obtained from these pilot projects, and they incorporated this learning into their own undertakings. However, at the mainstream level, the overall incorporation of this lessons learned was rather limited. Low-cost sanitation, livelihood support, housing construction, and access to microcredits. These were some of the usual types of supports that were created through these pilot projects. And while they were experimented in a few locations in Karachi, they were later on extended to several other urban locations in Pakistan and even abroad when the usefulness of this approach was found to be relevant. Another worthwhile pilot project was the incremental housing development, and this was begun in 1980s. It tried to fight out speculation existing in existing land supply. It was found that whenever the government would announce a housing scheme through the process of open application system, the middle classes and the affluent classes would access that housing, and obviously the urban poor were elbowed out. By learning this process, the administrators of a local municipality devised an innovative scheme in which they made the supply of land conditional to occupancy, meaning that anyone who showed the interest of accessing land, he was only given the right to that land if he would come down to that particular parcel of land and start construction immediately. Now, most of the urban poor did not possess the means and resources to start construction. So, in order to avoid losing them, this particular organization resorted to providing not only technical support, but also some very rudimentary assistance to enable these people create fundamental shelters for existing on that land. And later on, as the affordability status started growing, the other services began following. This was begun in Hyderabad Development Authority, uh, which was based and supposed to look after the city of Hyderabad. Later on, a local NGO, its name was Saiban, meaning shelter, that took over because as the management changed in the Hyderabad Development Authority and the new management was not very sympathetic to this pilot project, this NGO was formed and the process continued on. And the concept was taken to various cities in the country. The concept was very significant because it was able to combat not only speculation, it was able to also identify the right type of urban poor who were possessing all the right credentials but had very limited access to land supply. As a mark of its success, it was incorporated in the national housing policy. However, the overall expectation of mainstreaming of this particular innovation, that did not happen. This was, in fact, a study that was done about the land supply, and that this study and other similar type of initiatives contributed immensely, where it was found that the general tendency of people was to invest in land, and since this was an overarching tendency, therefore there was a need to find out ways and means in which the speculation could be warded away and access to land for the genuine poor could be initiated. This is an image of the very primordial times of the Khuda Ki Basti or the God settlement scheme. You can see that there is no consistency of building materials. The people were not discouraged from building with whatever material techniques and capabilities they possess. The real objective of the managers of this scheme was to ensure occupancy so that the people could gradually upgrade their shelter and the settlement could evolve in a step-by-step manner. This is a, a plan which shows that while the development and construction was done in different forms and ways, the layout was kept in a very regular rectilinear fashion in order to economize on the supply of services and also ensuring that with the passage of time, this settlement would become densified with, and also absorb more people. This is a view of the settlement several years ago. Now it has consolidated and people have made reasonable investment, which is actually showing in the built fabric, as we can see from this photograph. On the basis of learning that was derived from this innovation, there was a law that was promulgated that tried to ensure that all the plots of land for low-income people shall be delivered in the same way as was demonstrated in this project. However, the law was repealed because it did not serve the purpose and objectives of very powerful real estate developers that we have in plenty in the country. There was another innovation that was done by an NGO called as Catholic Social Service. This NGO ran a housing loan program in which it mobilized people to come together and access the housing loans and then, in fact, access housing in whatever form that was available in different communities. Now, since majority of the members that subscribe to this format, they belong to the Catholic community, the overall management and process of delivery was very well organized, and there were very few defaulters. And this rather small scale initiative was able to make substantial success. However, it could not be replicated to other locations because the Catholic Social Service was not able to provide the right type of mobilizational support to other types of communities that were not necessarily Catholic. Another success that was observed through a pilot project was the Aga Khan Agency for Habitat. This is an agency that basically focuses on the northern areas of Pakistan, which are very mountainous and possess a peculiar type of habitat. And this agency has rather been successful in mobilizing communities, engaging them with locally initiated projects, and also providing retrofitting services to the various types of vulnerabilities that the population in these locations face. Most of these locations experience seismic vulnerabilities, and substantial technical research has gone into providing assistance to these communities in upgrading their shelters. This is a view of the type of habitat that exists in these areas. It's very mountainous, a very desirable location for tourism as well. Thousands of people visit these mountain peaks. However, the local communities face very different types of challenges. This is a view of a housing unit that received assistance from the Khan Agency for Habitat. And while the scale may not necessarily be very large, but this agency continues to expand its work through mobilization and community action. Now, why the poor have not been able to obtain adequate housing, I think there are several reasons. One of them is that since the land supply is generally kept open, the real target group is missed out, and obviously the land which is essentially meant for housing turns into a kind of a real estate asset. Secondly, the housing finance option do not provide any type of tailor-made support to people who cannot fulfill the mortgage preconditions and other type of prerequisites. So a sizable part of people who do not possess the credit worthiness that is needed for formal housing credit, they are missed out. There are obviously a very limited research done in poverty assessment, and generally the government does not map out poverty in the real forms, and hence the consequent public sector investments into alleviating poverty and providing access to housing. That is also not done. Also, generally in Pakistan, we have an anti-poor bias where it is believed that the poor will be able to fend for themselves without being provided any type of meaningful support. And that is causing enormous amount of misery to this very vast target group. Land, which used to be a social asset, is now turned into a commodity, and much of its decisions related to it are actually done based upon the market precepts. And housing is also one such attribute. Housing is dealt through market-based mechanisms. It is no longer considered as a social service. There is a vast length of actors that we have in land and housing. We have the bureaucratic establishment. We have different types of national and international corporates. We have the lawmakers who influence land supply and other attributes of housing in their own constituencies. We have different types of clandestine crime syndicates who may not enter into the market through their formal existence, but they have a huge prevalence in the forms of influencing land and housing market in a big way. We have security agencies that try to influence housing supply to their own advantage. Then we have a large and expanding multitude of builders and developers who transform any available parcel of land into sellable property units. And then there are agents who deal and transact in these in this market. We have legal practitioners who try to influence the judicial system to the advantage of the realtors. And in many cases, we find that the genuine shelter seekers end up losing their lawsuits whenever such a situation arises. There have been several cases of public interest litigation also, where similar type of a disadvantage was experienced. We have religious and sectarian outfits also that influence housing, and in many ways, these very diverse interest groups, they try to influence the land market and the consequent housing development according to their respective objectives. The lessons learned and the way forward is that public access to information on land is a prerequisite, because usually whenever there is an initiative undertaken, there are all types of confusing, I would say, communication spread in which the real target group is not able to identify and in fact position themselves to access housing. And this basically is also a prerequisite to curb the malpractice and corruption, which is sizable in this sector. A poor-friendly culture needs to be introduced, because generally we find that the local and provincial governments, they do not deal with the poor, and especially the migrant poor, in a very appropriate manner. Usually the response is that since migrants are not the legal citizens or legal residents of a location, that's why they may not be privileged to access housing and other amenities in the same way. The transformation of poor models that are plenty in this country, I think if they are in fact transformed into policy, they can contribute immensely to the plight of the poor. There is a political consensus needed on this count, because there are divergent and diabolically opposite political parties, but when it comes to response in respect to the poor, and especially housing for the poor, I think all the political parties come on one page and say that this is a matter that can be dealt day after tomorrow. We need to have creation of various types of demonstration-driven projects, because the conditions are becoming more complex. And these projects at least create a ray of hope amongst practitioners and amongst some very rare breed of public-spirited bureaucrats who want to, in fact, capitalize on the research and similar undertakings done to create these type of demonstration effects for housing. I hope I did not overrun my time. Thank you very much. I hope I was able to make some sense in this discourse. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Majority of the problem and issue you just explained it is just very common with Africa. So when I'm just traveling in Africa, I just realized the global north is just a very good term. So the issue and the context is just very similar. I just take a lot of notes and important things from your slide, which we are just trying to implement in the South Africa as an example, and some other things we have to look at. Thank you very much again. And without further ado, we are just go to our third speaker, Dr. Abid Mahmoud from the Cardiff University. I just put his excellent bio in the chat for those people they want to know more about the Dr. Abid. Doctor, the floor is yours. You can just, should I share for you?
Yes,
right?
you could share.
Sure. I will do that one. Let me just share that on.
So first of all, I would like to thank Professor Kathy Mitchell and Professor Numan Ahmed for setting up the scene, which is actually gives me an opportunity to speak through the lens of social innovation as an add-on to the current issues and problems which we have been facing, particularly in the global South context. But from my own perspective, I have been working for over 15 years in the European context of social innovation. And one of the things, one of the reasons why I chose this title and this talk today was to answer two questions, one of the questions which have been asked, I think it is an age-old question, which was asked decades ago and still being asked, is what if the people or the communities or the slum dwellers, in some cases, were part of the urban planning or city planning process? What if we gave them, the state or planners or designers or professionals gave these people some resources and look at things from the lens of the people, from the eyes of the people? And it would hopefully, it would essentially, particularly, it will flip the lens, it will completely change the perspective, hopefully, if we do this. And I will also take this opportunity, because I see we are all academics speaking today, that there is also some concern or some limits in the academia. There is some level of silos or tribalism which exists in academia between the people who are working, we can say, in global north and people working global south, or even within the global north. From my own experience of working in Europe, there is a huge differentiation between the north and south divide, Nordic countries, southern countries, East and Western Europe. So the divides, they do exist, but somehow there has been some lack of exchange of knowledge, exchange of concepts, ideas, new theories, which have not really traveled between the two. I won't say between north or south, from south or north. I think the exchange is supposed to be bilateral. So there has to be continuous learning, and there are examples on both sides of the divide, if there is any. So when we talk about the sustainable, innovative, and affordable housing, we are talking about understanding. From my own perspective, I would like to develop an understanding of social innovation and give some examples. But before we start, just to revisit the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which even after 73 years, almost 73 years after its pronouncement, is still, we can see that not everyone has access to the right to the housing. Slums, squatters, shacks, favelas, refugee camps, and other informal or illegal urban settlements, they still reflect the immensity of this inadequate housing in the cities particularly. It also reflects how states have been particularly unable to respond to their citizens' housing needs, especially in the face of the rapid urbanization. And on the next slide, it just gives this very difficult nature of the concept of social innovation, as it happens with any social scientific concepts or definition. As you may agree that in social sciences, there is no hard and fast rule. There is no fixed definition. We don't have laws of motion, universal laws, which we could interact with or have them written on the stone. So these notions, these concepts, these theories and their application and practices, they can vary from place to place, and they can vary from time to time and according to the situation. So there are different concepts, meanings, and applications of social innovation are existing. But the social, as Kathy particularly was referring to, has been often misused or often abused in terms of just fulfilling certain ambitions of the policymakers, especially. So here I will be talking about social innovation from the perspective of social inclusion as a way of human interactions and relationships, and how these interrelationships can transform social, economic, political, and cultural institutions over the time, and with a focus on leaving a profound impact on the society, some positive impact. Moving on, this is an intentionally hijacked definitions or definitions of social innovation. These are not which any academic would probably agree with, but this is how the governments, the policymakers, the politicians tend to use these. So, for example, in the case of U.S., Obama administration established an Office of Social Innovation and Civic Participation with the sole purpose of investing in social enterprises or encouraging startups. In the European Union, with their new funding stream being announced, the social innovation remains at the core of every future research, almost every future research which they are going to fund. And the idea you can see is particularly is to do more with less and do it better. So how you could do this, for them, social innovation may appear as a panacea. In the UK's case, we have a National Endowment for Science and Technology, in short NESTA, which is the flag bearer of social innovation, socially innovative initiatives. But you can see in all the cases, or in most of the situations, the use or concept of this setting up perspectives of social innovation is mostly as a response to the crises which have happened in the financial crisis of 2008. Not only the governments have switched their focus, but also you can see that the whole concept of corporate social responsibility has been gradually being transformed into corporate social innovation to promote greater good and assure, from the corporation's perspective, reassure their users, their consumers, that these corporations, they do possess long-term social purposes. Moving on to the more academic aspects of social innovation, the definitions, there are at least three dimensions of social innovation. First of all is addressing and satisfying the basic human needs, and then how social relations could be strengthened between the communities, and finally how communities can be empowered. And then I will discuss this in terms of the couple of examples which I will discuss because of the shortage of time. So I will move to the next slide, which is also more of a setting up the context of why do we need social innovation. So main focus is to address or to tackle the wicked problems. So wicked problems, they appear in all sorts of ways and manners, but we can define these problems as those whose solutions require to change the whole mindset and behavior, not only of the people, but also professionals, all kinds of communities. So wicked problems are difficult to or almost impossible to solve because of their incomplete or contradictory or changing nature or requirements. And it is very difficult sometimes to recognize. So the example of poverty we have seen in the previous presentations, that even poverty can be defined in different contexts by different countries over different periods of time. Similarly, we have the problems of climate change. Next, the social innovation is also about addressing the vulnerabilities. The built environment, particularly alongside the relative poverty, it does play a critical role in the vulnerability. For example, children, young people, women, elderly, and also those with special needs are vulnerable to the limiting factors. For example, in indoor housing conditions, lack of sunlight, lack of ventilation, lack of mobility, but also lack of physical space in many low-income and high-density areas or dwellings. So there is a need to develop alternative solutions to these vulnerabilities. These could be retrofitting, redesigning the indoor environments, addressing users' needs. And next, I will give some quick examples. I'll quickly go through them. First is the case of We Can Make. So these three examples I have picked up particularly on the basis of the fact that these were not funded by any state or any large institutions, but they were bottom-up initiatives, in many cases grassroots, by smaller NGOs or small civil society groups, organizations. In this case, We Can Make is a partnership of a digital arts and social innovation center and an architectural practice. What they did was that they identified, they sat together with the communities and asked what was the main problem in our area. And it appeared that housing was the major issue. So what they did was to develop a citizen-led, more of a test space, looking at the spaces in different locations. For example, if some people have a lack of space or they have extra space, or there are other spaces in the neighborhood which could be reutilized, repurposed, and they worked together, professionals worked with the communities and also found different ways of finding ways out of the planning legislations, planning policy guidelines, and it is something which is in progress, but it does introduce a new approach to making use of the microsites to address the housing gap. Next is the example of home share, which was again, it is this kind of initiatives have been happening in many countries across the world. In the UK, it was initiated by a very small organization, but they did develop a network and tried to look at the spare rooms with the elderly people. Many of the elderly people have been living in houses, mostly living alone and having extra space. So the idea was to find matchmaking and getting young people to work and or help support these older people in their everyday chores. And actually, again, recover the housing gap. Next is the a program which YLab or ERLab is a Welsh word. They worked with some community organizations on a pilot project to support those young people who have just come out of the care leaver. So the care system in the UK works in such a way that once a child reaches certain age, the responsibility of the state is finished and these people are left literally out in the street. And so the idea was to find ways to help these people accommodate or using a step-down accommodation approach, and also training and developing new skills in them. Finally, next slide is about a project which I've been working on with Ali and some other colleagues in South Africa. In Jordan, we are looking at the refugee settlements. In Nepal, we are looking at the small and large squatter settlements in the capital city of Kathmandu. And we have been looking at particularly the aspects, the challenges which communities, especially the informal settlements, they have been facing in the wake of the pandemic. And we have been looking at different characteristics, and so things have not really developed yet. So we have conducted the first part of the research, and now we are in the process of analyzing. So I would say watch out the space for further information, and hopefully we will find something more interesting and would share with everyone. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Doc. It's just very interesting. And some of the example you just tried to share with us from the European context, I think we can just adopt it and just localize it in the context of the Africa. So even as a temporary solution, we can just use those things to just found like a permanent solution for the affordable housing, which is just coming either from the PPP system or coming from the local or the national government. One of the very important points you just highlighted is just not only waiting for the government. So the NGO or the people or the community should to come and help the other community, which is just very true. We just see this is just pick up here in the South Africa. And recently some other NGO is just coming to help the other poor community or vulnerable community. Thank you very much. So we have a very few minutes time for the Q&A, but first of all, Professor Cathy has other meetings, so he just apologized and just left the workshop. But is there any question for her? I will just collect that one and just send it to her so we can just get her response and just share it with the person. Are one of the favorite person in the workshop, always making very interesting questions. Sonia, do you want to ask your series of the question? Because I see you have a nice question about the poor community, cities, definition of the cities. Do you want to ask yourself? Sonia is still with us.
Sorry. So what I wanted to say was, I don't need to really ask my questions. I think they're self-evident. But what I try to do is just kind of get away from jargon. And I think one of the most damaging ways of talking is to talk about the poor, because it excludes them, which is why I really like Abid Mehmood's talk about inclusive design of cities and inclusive thinking of a city, setting up different kinds of relations. I think it was my father used to say, people become the names that you call them. So, if you start treating people like citizens, then maybe things will start changing. So I think that's really enough from my side. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sonia. And yes, I just also noted a lot of good things that Sonia is just shared with us for the latest project, which we are just busy with the Abid. And hopefully we just come out with some like a good result from the second workshop, which is just coming in few weeks. The next question is just came from the Jenny. Jenny, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, thanks, Ollie. I was just making a comment, and I come from a civil engineering background. I was making a comment about urbanization, and our government is really struggling to maintain infrastructure as it is, and unfortunately, there are no prizes for rehabilitation of old infrastructure, but there's always gold ribbons and presentations and pictures in the newspaper when you build new infrastructure. So can we not slow urbanization down by having new cities built on the peripheral of existing cities so that they don't become large and unmanageable? But, these new cities like China is building, they all depend on good infrastructure, and that is a challenge. And I think the same challenge that Dr. Mehmood alluded to, infrastructure is needed to establish those communities, cities, and that will also generate work. So, there is a way, but it's not always. Somebody has to go first and establish something, which I believe is infrastructure. And once a road is there, you'll get buses and taxis and vehicles moving in. People will establish jobs around that, and that will then establish the housing need in the various different sectors that is needed, including affordable housing.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure if the Dr. Mehmood or the Prof. Ahmed wants to add something.
I'll just make a quick comment. It's a very valid observation. especially in the global south, where the overall process of urbanization is very fast, and it appears to be a very, I would say, the only solution that many of underprivileged folks and people who are in fact migrating and relocating to certain locations they find, maybe through some sort of a concentrated effort and creation of a parallel set of incentives. Uh, Deconcentration from the larger cities can be undertaken, and maybe the visibility and the rather invisible merits of certain smaller towns and smaller settlements that could be highlighted. And this could only be done uh, through a kind of a cooperative engagement between the people belonging to such locations and the policymakers. Uh, the general tendency of our policymakers as such is that they are usually very much overwhelmed by the presence and the so-called merits of larger cities and larger settlements. So I believe if maybe through a dent could be made through the process of research and communication that can help create that alternative path in a very interesting way.
Yes, yes, I agree. Yes, Jane, Jenny, do you want to just add something? I see your hands is up.
Yes, thanks, Ali. Just to add on to that, in South Africa, we had this rural housing projects policy from our Department of Human Settlements, where they tried to, I think, for two reasons. They tried to stem urbanization by creating rural housing projects, but I think there was also a political side behind that. But let's stay on the housing side. They created thousands and thousands of urban rural houses, but there was no other development that took place around it. So we invested billions of rands into rural housing projects, just finding that people moved from an informal house or traditional house into the government house, and the children or parents still relocated to the cities to find work. So it didn't really help.
Yeah, you have a very good point here. Yes, you are right. Not only in the South Africa, we just saw it, the other things. So the things we have to do it, we need to just develop the opportunity or the infrastructure, as you mentioned, then relocate the people to that area, not to bring the people there, then leave them without enough or adequate infrastructure or something like that. That's some of the cases of the Kalija case. We just see it in the Cape Town, which we studied that one. So the people every day, 2 hours, they're just driving or using the public transport into the Cape Town, like the whole family coming in the Cape Town, then just leave Cape Town at the evening. So that's the exactly right one. Dr. Mahmoud, do you want to add something?
I just wanted to add that we should be very careful when we are looking at the expansions or new settlements or building, developing new lands, because there is always a certain cost which we have to pay. For example, either we lose farmlands or we lose some forests. So there has to be some kind of give and take, which is going to happen anyway. In the UK perspective, particularly in Wales, we can see that whatever could be built has been built. So all the cities, they have been historically there, they have developed, so they were built in such a way that they are not prone to the natural disasters. But what's happening now is that all the new developments, as the cities are expanding, new developments are going into the floodplains and more of the risky locations, either taking over the agricultural land. But in most of the cases, all the new flooding incidences, flash floods, they are quite common now. They are happening because of these new developments, that although planners were very careful in laying out all the infrastructure for these sites, but still what they did not consider was talking to the local farmers who knew that historically these lands have been the floodplains where all the water gathers for a few hours maybe. And then once these houses are built and there's heavy rain, and suddenly you see that these are the main culprits, which completely clog the rivers up the stream. So most of the incidents which have been happening around Cardiff are because of these new developments.
Yeah, that's another issue we have it here also in the South Africa or in the global South. Without a study enough, without talking with the community or the people, they have a knowledge, we just do some like development, and then we just saw some like a flood, some disaster is just coming and destroy all the investment. That's the right things. So we don't have enough time, but I want to just end the workshop with the question. Janie has just raised a very good point. What's the question here with the 4th industrial revolution and with all this kind of innovative technology? Do we need that kind of mega cities when the people, they can work from home, from far? So do we need to just relocate all the people to the mega city or something like that? I think the context is different. I think the environment is changed. So maybe we can just make the rural area more attractive and just make it some like more opportunity for the farmers to stay in the rural area to just provide more food, more secure food supply, and also reduce the problem in the mega city. With that question, I want to thank all of you for the participating and listening to us, and I want thank you all to all 3 excellent speakers, Professor Ahmed, Dr. Mahmoud, and Professor Michel. The records for this workshop and the slide will be available soon in the SIAH workshop, in the SIAH website. So please visit the SIAH website and just get the records or the slide you want. And if you like to participate in the SIAH for Africa design competition, all the information you need is just in the website. Please look at the website. And if you have any other question, please let me know. So I'm just very happy to just answer your question. Thank you very much, everybody, and keep safe and have a wonderful day.
Thank you very much, Yes.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you, Abed.